Welcome back to Dravin's Den. I am Dravin. You know, when most people think about history, they imagine great wars, powerful leaders, famous speeches, moments so enormous they seem almost inevitable. But the longer I study history, the more I realize something. History rarely changes because of one gigantic event. It changes because someone, somewhere, makes one decision. Sometimes it's a courageous decision. Sometimes it's selfish. And sometimes it's made in desperation. But sometimes it's made completely by accident. But once that decision is made, there's no putting history back the way it was. Tonight we're traveling through the final days of June and the first week of July. 2 weeks filled with moments where people stood at crossroads and unknowingly changed millions of lives. Some decisions built nations. Some decisions started wars. Some decisions offered hope when the world desperately needed it. And one commander ignored nearly every warning anyone gave him. History can be inspiring. It can be heartbreaking. And every once in a while, it reminds us just how human we really are. Welcome to the Den. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1944. The Second World War is still raging across Europe and the Pacific. Young Americans are storming beaches in Normandy, fighting through the hedgerows of France, flying bombing missions over Germany, battling island by island across the Pacific Ocean. Victory is beginning to feel possible, but it is far from guaranteed. Back home, another question hangs over Washington. What happens when they come home? It wasn't an imaginary concern. Only 25 years earlier, millions of soldiers had returned from the First World War. Many struggled to find work. Some ended up unemployed. Others became homeless. In 1932, thousands of veterans marched on Washington demanding the bonus payments they had been promised. History remembers them as the Bonus Army. The government responded by sending U.S. troops to remove them. It was a national embarrassment. America wasn't about to make that mistake again. So on June 22, 1944, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. Officially, it was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, but most people simply know it as the GI Bill. On paper, it looked almost ordinary. Educational benefits, low-interest home loans, business loans, unemployment assistance. But what it accomplished was extraordinary. Imagine a 21-year-old Marine returning home after months in the Pacific. He grew up believing college was for wealthy families. His parents couldn't afford tuition. Now, because of the GI Bill, he could become the first person in his family to earn a degree. Picture a young Army nurse returning from Europe. Instead of wondering where she'll live, she qualifies for a mortgage that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Across America, millions of veterans suddenly had opportunities that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Between 1944 and 1956, nearly 8 million veterans used the education benefits provided by the GI Bill. Colleges expanded rapidly. Universities built new campuses. Community colleges flourished. The law didn't just educate individuals. It transformed higher education in America forever. The housing provisions had an equally dramatic effect. Millions of veterans purchased homes. Entire suburbs sprang up almost overnight. Communities like Levittown became symbols of post-war America. The middle class expanded at an unprecedented pace. Small businesses opened, families grew, neighborhoods flourished. Of course, history is rarely perfect. Not every veteran benefited equally, because many loans were administered locally. Racial discrimination often prevented black veterans from receiving the same opportunities as their white counterparts. That painful reality reminds us that even America's greatest achievements often arrived with unfinished work still ahead. But taken as a whole, the GI Bill changed the trajectory of the nation. Few laws have ever had such a profound effect on education, home ownership, economic growth, and the lives of ordinary citizens. Sometimes, the most powerful decision a government can make is deciding to invest in its people. While America was preparing to welcome millions of soldiers home, another decision, made nearly 70 years earlier, would become one of the most famous military disasters in American history. There were some names in history that almost everyone recognizes: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and George Armstrong Custer. Most people know the story by its nickname, Custer's Last Stand. But like many famous moments in history, the real story is far more complicated. To understand what happened, we have to begin long before a single shot was fired. The United States was expanding westward at an astonishing pace. Railroads crossed the plains. Settlers poured into territories that had long been home to Native American nations. Treaties were signed, then broken. New treaties replaced old ones. Those, too, were often ignored. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota, thousands of miners flooded into lands that had been guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux by treaty. The Lakota refused to leave. The U.S. government demanded they report to reservations. Many chose not to. War became almost inevitable. Among the native leaders are two men whose names deserve to be remembered. Sitting Bull, a spiritual leader who, according to Lakota tradition, experienced a vision predicting victory over U.S. forces. And Crazy Horse, a brilliant warrior respected even by many of his enemies. Together, they united thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho people into one of the largest native encampments ever seen on the Great Plains. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was confident, perhaps too confident. Custer had earned fame during the Civil War. He believed speed and aggression attacks won battles. His orders were to locate the native encampment and prevent it from escaping until additional troops arrived. Instead, he chose to attack immediately. Several of his own Crow and Arikara, A-R-I-K-A-R-A. Forgive me, I don't want to pronounce these wrong, but sometimes I'm going to have to rely on you guys. But several of his own scouts warned him. They climbed high bluffs overlooking the valley and saw something astonishing. The village stretched for miles. There weren't hundreds of warriors. There were thousands. One scout reportedly told Custer, "There are enough Indians to walk over the hills like grasshoppers." But Custer either didn't believe him or believed surprise alone would carry the day. He divided his regiment into 3 separate battalions. In military history, dividing your force in the face of a much larger army is almost always dangerous. On June 25, 1876, that decision proved fatal. Major Marcus Reno attacked the southern end of the village and was quickly overwhelmed. Captain Frederick Benteen was ordered to support Custer but arrived too late. Custer and roughly 210 men advanced towards the northern end of the encampment. What happened next remains one of history's most studied battles. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors responded with remarkable speed. Instead of retreating, they surrounded Custer's isolated command. Warriors under leaders including Crazy Horse launched repeated attacks. Within a matter of hours, Custer, his 2 brothers, his nephew, and his brother-in-law, and every soldier under his immediate command were dead. Not one survived to tell the story. When relief forces finally arrived the following day, they found the battlefield silent. Scattered across Last Stand Hill lay the bodies of Custer and his men. News of the defeat shocked the nation. It happened during America's centennial celebration. Only days after the country had celebrated 100 years of independence, it learned one of its most famous military officers had been defeated. For years, the battle was portrayed as a heroic last stand against overwhelming odds. Modern historians paint a more complete picture. It was also the story of native nations fighting to protect their homes, their families, and their way of life. Within a year, many of those same tribes would face relentless military campaigns. The buffalo herds that sustained them would be devastated. Reservations would expand. Traditional ways of life would forever be altered. Little Bighorn wasn't the end of the story, though. It was the beginning of another, one whose consequences are still discussed today. Sometimes history isn't about heroes and villains. Sometimes it's about the people, caught in a collision neither side truly knew how to stop. While one battlefield became famous for the decisions made in the heat of combat, another decision, made more than 70 years later, would prove that sometimes the strongest response to aggression isn't violence at all. Sometimes it's compassion. When World War II ended in 1945, Germany wasn't simply defeated, it was divided. The country and its capital city of Berlin was split into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. At first, the uneasy alliance held. After all, they had just defeated Nazi Germany together. But it didn't take long for old suspicions to return. The Soviet Union wanted communist governments across Eastern Europe. The Western Allies believed democratic nations should determine their own futures. The friendship that had defeated Hitler quickly dissolved into distrust. Then in June of 1948, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin made a decision. If he couldn't force the Western Allies out of Berlin, perhaps he could starve them out. On June 24th, Soviet forces blocked every highway, railroad, and canal leading into West Berlin. No food, no coal, no medicine, no fuel. More than 2 million civilians suddenly found themselves trapped inside an island surrounded by hostile territory. Stalin believed the Americans, British, and French would eventually abandon the city. It seemed logical. Supplying an entire city by air? Impossible. Or so everyone thought. President Harry Truman faced one of the most difficult decisions of his presidency. Send armed convoys? That risked another world war. Abandon Berlin? That would hand one of Europe's most important cities to the Soviet Union. Instead, he chose a third option. Fly everything in. What followed became one of history's greatest humanitarian efforts, the Berlin Airlift. Day and night, cargo planes landed every few minutes. Food, flour, milk, medicine, coal, machinery. Everything the people of Berlin needed to survive. Pilots flew in every kind of weather. Rain, fog, snow, ice. They landed, unloaded, and took off. And another aircraft appeared only minutes later. At the height of the operation, a plane landed roughly every 30 seconds. Think about that. Every 30 seconds around the clock for months. One pilot in particular became legendary. Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen. While visiting the perimeter fence near Tempelhof Airport, he noticed German children quietly watching the airplanes. They didn't beg, they didn't complain, they just simply watched. Halvorsen reached into his pocket. All he had were 2 sticks of chewing gum. He handed them through the fence. The children carefully divided even the wrappers among themselves so everyone could smell the sweet scent. He was deeply moved. The next day, he tied candy bars and chewing gum to tiny handkerchief parachutes and dropped them from his plane as he approached the runway. Soon, other pilots joined him. Thousands of tiny parachutes drifted down carrying chocolate, gum, and hope. The children nicknamed him the Candy Bomber. By the time Berlin Airlift ended in May of 1949, more than 277,000 flights had delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies. Stalin blinked first. The blockade failed. Not because of bombs, not because of tanks, because thousands of ordinary people refused to let an entire city starve. Sometimes history changes because compassion proves stronger than intimidation. Only a few decades earlier, another decision had changed the entire world. One wrong turn. One young man standing outside a cafe. One gunshot. And suddenly, millions of lives would never be the same. History has a strange sense of irony. Sometimes, events so enormous begin with something almost unbelievable. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, arrived for an official visit. Security was present. Crowds lined the street. Several young conspirators belonging to a Siberian nationalist organization called the Black Hand positioned themselves along the motorcade route. Their mission? Assassination. The first attempt came early. One conspirator threw a bomb towards the Archduke's open car. It bounced off the folded convertible roof, rolled underneath the vehicle behind him, and exploded. Several officers were wounded, but Franz Ferdinand survived. The motorcade sped away. If history had ended there, World War I might never have happened. The Archduke continued with his schedule. Later that morning, he insisted on visiting the wounded officers at the hospital. His driver received revised directions. Unfortunately, he wasn't told clearly enough. At one intersection, the driver made a wrong turn. The car slowed and stopped to back up. Suddenly, only a few feet away, quite by accident, was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, one of the assassins. Earlier that morning, he believed the mission had failed. Now, history had driven directly to him. He stepped forward, pulled out a pistol, fired 2 shots. One struck Franz Ferdinand. The other hit his wife, Sophie. Both died in minutes. By itself, the assassination was tragic. But it wasn't the shooting that changed history. It was the chain reaction. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Russia supported Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France stood with Russia. Britain entered after Germany invaded Belgium. Treaties signed years earlier suddenly activated like falling dominoes. Within weeks, Europe was at war. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1918, more than 16 million people were dead. Entire empires had disappeared, maps redrawn. A political instability left behind would eventually help create the conditions for World War II, all because a driver took a wrong turn on a city street. History doesn't always change because someone plans it. Sometimes it changes because fate has astonishing timing. If Sarajevo, S-A-R-A-J-E-V-O, Sarajevo, yeah, I think that's right. If Sarajevo marked the beginning of one devastating war, the rolling hills of Pennsylvania became the place where another war, America's bloodiest, began turning towards its conclusion. The summer of 1863. The Civil War had already raged for more than 2 years. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Families were divided. Entire towns had emptied of young men. Confederate General Robert E. Lee believed the time had come to carry the war north. His Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania. He hoped a major victory on Union soil might force the North to negotiate peace. Perhaps even convince Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy. The two armies weren't looking for each other. Not exactly. The town of Gettysburg happened to sit where several roads crossed. Like so many turning points in history, the battle began almost accidentally. On July 1st, Confederate troops entered Gettysburg searching for supplies. Union cavalry under General John Buford recognized the importance of the high ground surrounding the town. Instead of retreating, Buford decided to hold. He knew reinforcements were coming. His outnumbered cavalry delayed Confederate advances just long enough for Union infantry to arrive. That single decision changed everything. For the next 3 days, Gettysburg became the largest battle ever fought on Northern American soil. Nearly 165,000 soldiers collided across fields, orchards, rocky hills, and wheat farms. On the second day, fighting centered around places whose names still echo through American history. Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard, Little Round Top. Perhaps the most dramatic story unfolded on Little Round Top. The Union's far left flank. If it fell, the entire Union line might collapse. Defending that hill was the 20th Marine Infantry under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Wave after wave of Confederate attacks climbed the rocky slope. The men of the 20th Maine fought desperately. Eventually, their ammunition ran out. No bullets remained. Many commanders would have ordered retreat. Chamberlain, however, made another decision, one that has become legendary. He ordered bayonets. His exhausted soldiers fixed bayonets and charged downhill. The Confederates, stunned by the sudden assault, fell back. Little Round Top held. Years later, many historians would argue that Chamberlain's decision helped save the Union's left flank, and perhaps the battle itself. On July 3rd, General Lee made one final gamble. Approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers emerged from tree line and advanced across nearly a mile of open ground towards the Union center. It became known as Pickett's Charge. Union artillery tore enormous gaps through the advancing line. Rifle fire intensified. When the survivors finally reached the stone wall of Cemetery Ridge, they could go no farther. The attack collapsed. Lee's army retreated towards Virginia. He would never again invade the North. Gettysburg didn't end the Civil War, but it changed its direction. Sometimes history turns because one commander chooses to stand his ground, while another chooses to gamble everything. Gettysburg reminded America that it would cost to preserve the Union, but preserving the Union and ensuring that all Americans shared equally in its promises were two very different challenges. More than 100 years later, another signature, placed on another document, would change everyday life for millions of people. History often remembers great battles. It remembers presidents, it remembers speeches. But sometimes history changes because someone signs a piece of paper. On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson sat at a desk in the East Room of the White House. He was surrounded by members of Congress, civil rights leaders, clergy, journalists, and invited guests. He picked up several pens and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The applause that followed lasted only moments. The impact has lasted generations. To understand why, we have to remember that everyday life, what it looked like before that signature. Across much of America, particularly the South, segregation wasn't simply a social custom. It was the law. Restaurants could refuse service because of the color of someone's skin. Hotels could turn families away. Movie theaters, swimming pools, waiting rooms, schools, drinking fountains, even restrooms were often separated by race. Job opportunities frequently determined not by talent, but by prejudice. The road to that July afternoon had been long and often dangerous. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a Montgomery bus. The Montgomery bus boycott followed. A young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as one of the movement's most powerful voices. Students staged sit-ins at lunch counters. Freedom riders challenged segregation on interstate buses, often enduring brutal attacks. In Birmingham, Alabama, television cameras captured police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses turned against peaceful demonstrators. The images shocked the nation. Then came August 28, 1963. More than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was there that Dr. King delivered one of the most recognizable speeches in American history. I have a dream. Those weren't just beautiful words. They were a challenge. A reminder that America's founding promises belong to everyone. After months of debate, filibusters, compromise, and political courage from leaders in both major parties, Congress finally passed the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson later remarked that signing it would cost his party political support in parts of the South for years. He signed it anyway. Sometimes leadership means making decisions you know will come with consequences. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. It outlawed segregation in restaurants, hotels, theaters, and many other public places. It strengthened the federal government's ability to enforce school desegregation. It prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It wasn't the end of the civil rights movement. Oh, it was far from it. The Voting Rights Act would follow in 1965. Many struggles remained. Some still continue, even today. But July 2nd, 1964, marked one of the most significant steps America had ever taken toward fulfilling a promise first written in Philadelphia in 1776. History reminds us that freedom isn't simply declared. Sometimes it must be defended, expanded, and renewed. And then, every year, there comes one day that invites Americans to pause, to celebrate, and perhaps to remember why all of these stories matter. Every 4th of July, millions of Americans gather beneath summer skies. Backyard grills fill the air with the smell of hamburgers and hot dogs. Children chase fireflies. Families spread blankets across parks waiting for fireworks to begin. Flags wave from porches. Neighbors laugh together. For many, it's simply a wonderful summer holiday. But beneath the fireworks, beneath the parades, beneath the music, lies something much older, an idea. The Declaration of Independence wasn't a promise that America had already achieved liberty and equality for everyone. It was a promise that those ideals were worth pursuing. Generation after generation has inherited that promise. Some defended it on battlefields. Some defended it in courtrooms. Some defended it in classrooms. Some defended it in peaceful marches through city streets. Every generation has been asked the same question. How will you leave the country for those who come after you? Perhaps that's the true meaning of Independence Day. not simply celebrating where we've been, but remembering our responsibility for where we're going. All right, let's get a break in the chaos here and the hope for a new generation. Tonight's story takes us back to the year 897. And yes, this is the next edition of What the Hell, people. I promise you, every word of this is true. History has given us kings who declared war over insults, generals who attacked impossible odds, inventors who built unbelievable machines. But every once in a while, history gives us something so unbelievably bizarre that even Hollywood would reject it as unrealistic. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod. After Pope Formosus died, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, developed an obsession with setting old political scores. Now, most people write angry letters, maybe post something online. Pope Stephen had another idea. He ordered Formosa's body dug up. Yes, you heard that correctly. The corpse, several months dead, was exhumed from its grave. It was dressed once again in full papal robes, placed on a throne, and brought into church to stand trial. An actual trial. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the dead pope. Charges were read aloud. Witnesses testified. Questions were asked to a corpse. Predictably, the dead man told no tales, nor offered no defense. The court found him guilty. His papacy was declared invalid. The 3 fingers he had used to give blessing were cut from his hand. His papal robes were stripped away. His body was first buried in a common grave, then later dug up again and thrown into the Tiber River. Needless to say, many people were horrified. Public outrage grew quickly. Before long, Pope Stephen himself was overthrown, imprisoned, and eventually died in captivity. Future popes reversed many of his decisions, and history looked back on the entire affair with one overwhelming question. What the hell were you people thinking? Sometimes history is inspiring, sometimes it's tragic, and sometimes humanity completely loses its mind. Tonight we've traveled from battlefields to classrooms, from divided nations to divided streets, from courageous decisions to catastrophic mistakes. Every one of these stories shared something in common. Someone made a choice. A president chose to invest in returning veterans. A military commander ignored warnings. Pilots chose compassion instead of hatred. A driver made a wrong turn. Soldiers chose to stand their ground. Lawmakers chose to expand the promise of equal rights. And one medieval pope, well, he made a decision that probably should have stayed inside his own head. History isn't simply a collection of dates. It's a collection of decisions. Some inspire us. Some warn us. All of them remind us that ordinary people, often in ordinary moments, shape the future in extraordinary ways. The decisions we make today may become the history someone else tells tomorrow. Thank you for spending part of your evening here in the den. I'm Dravin, and until next time, keep looking for the stories hidden between the dates. Good night.